Hi, I'm Bryan Monacelli, Chief of the Safety Branch with the Office of Fire Prevention and Control. Thank you for watching this training video. The 2024 Firefighter Safety Stand-Down theme is Fire Training Back to Basics. For Wednesday, it is Safety During Training. This presentation will be on firefighter safety during training. So is there really a problem? Well, the U.S. Fire Administration reports that in the decade from 2012 through 2021, there were an average of 10 line-of-duty deaths per year during firefighter training. The National Fire Protection Association, which tracks firefighter injury data, in 2022 reported that just shy of 14% of all firefighter injuries occurred during training. That's over 9,000 injuries that year. 57% of those training-related injuries were strains, sprains, and muscular pain. That by far makes up the biggest category of injuries during training. From there, in order, wounds and cuts follow, then fractures, dislocations, thermal stress, burns, and some combination of smoke inhalation, respiratory issues. As you can see, safety and training is a very important topic for this year's Firefighter Safety Stand-Down. If it's your goal within your organization to develop a safety culture where safety is the norm and accepted and expressed and talked about by your members, talking about safety in training is a great place to begin. If you emphasize safety in training, that will leach into your operations and help you develop that safety culture. So, how do you choose the right instructors for your training to meet this lofty goal? We need to use qualified instructors. Qualified doesn't just mean that they're a certified, trained instructor. You can get that training through the office. It's offered regionally throughout the state. You'll see principles of instruction classes, Fire and Emergency Service Instructor 1 classes. On the career side, people might attend flips to get that course. That's all over the place. That's easy to find. And that is an important part of this. But also, is the instructor qualified to talk about and train the topic that they're going to be training in? Do they have the desirable characteristics that you would seek out of an instructor? Do they emphasize safety? Do they value safety and preach that in the training programs? Another consideration is making sure that you have enough instructors working for the training evolution. Do you have enough instructors to provide for a safe and effective training, such that there's adequate supervision, there's a good ratio of instructors to students, and all important safety-related roles are covered? A lot of our trainings should have a dedicated safety officer, a person whose sole role is that of safety. It is required in accordance with NFPA 1403 for all live fire training and in accordance with NFPA 1404 for any respiratory protection training, but there's other times when it should be done. Consider other high hazard or physically intense training. If you're working people hard, you should have a safety officer, that's their sole duty. If you're doing things that you don't do on the normal, some of that higher risk, lower frequency training, like our special operations training, you should have a standalone safety officer. And just think about what the evolutions are. If there's added risk to what you're doing beyond a typical training, just consider posting a separate safety officer where that's their sole responsibility. That person's role is entirely just prevention of unsafe acts and elimination of unsafe conditions. They have a really big responsibility that starts before the training ever begins. They should talk to the instructor ahead of time, find out what's going to be occurring, and make sure that there's nothing that's going to occur that is unsafe. They should check equipment to make sure that it's safe to operate. They should safety brief all of the training participants, which includes the instructors. Their job is a very active role. It is not a passive, sit back, observe, wait for something to happen role. They're staying busy looking for problems before they become problems. They have the authority to alter, suspend, or terminate the training evolutions. Just like a safety officer on an incident, that is a big responsibility and a high level of authority to be able to say, stop this training evolution, this isn't safe, or we need to do things differently. There's a variety of reasons that somebody might need to do that in that safety officer role. It's important that they have the authority to do that. So who's the safety officer when there isn't one assigned? The lead instructor is always responsible for safety and has to act as that safety officer in the absence of a dedicated safety officer. Now, safety is everyone's responsibility, and a good safety culture Your people are going to believe that. They're going to feel that. They're going to embody that role. And you'll get there eventually. And this is a great starting point. But if you don't have a dedicated safety officer, it's really important that your lead instructor do that full role of safety officer on top of their instruction. So some considerations. Slip, trips, and falls we know are our most common source of injury in the fire service and in training in particular. So just little things like considering walking surfaces, emphasizing safety when climbing, things like that can go a long ways towards preventing these. Safe lifting. How many of you have actually been trained on how to lift safely? I'm sure many of you do EMS as well as the fire service, right? So going back to your EMT class, did you receive more training in safe lifting than about 2 slides in the curriculum? Did anybody actually walk through the body mechanics of lifting? If you haven't trained your members on how to safely lift, there is a high potential for back injuries related to lifting in the fire service and in EMS. Train your people how to lift safely. Working from heights. In training, we should have a lower appetite for risk than we do in responses. So consider, when we're working from heights, are there extra safeguards that we should put in place? How high is too high before we put a belay on a person to make sure that should they slip, should they fall, that reduces the chances of injury? What about fall protection mats? Do you have any fall protection mats that you could place under and around ladders when people are working from height doing vertical evolutions? Use of SCBA confidence or firefighter survival props. These props that include entanglement hazards or confined areas. They might have reduced ability to access a firefighter involved in training. These are higher hazards. So just consider if somebody were to be injured inside of one of these props, how are you going to access that person, provide care, and get them out of the prop? The prop should be designed to allow that. What about the use of victims, live victims, during training? Obviously, everybody knows no live victims for live fire training, right? But what about other training? Do you use live victims when you're doing rope rescue training? Do you do live victims when you're doing fast training? Just consider, is it safer and just as effective to use a mannequin as compared to using a live victim? Consider what the risk is to the person, the victim, the live person, if they were to be dropped, if anything were to go wrong. Do they have the ability to catch themselves, right? Consider the training evolution and the value of having a mannequin versus a real person. And in many cases, we don't need to use a live person to simulate a victim in our training. We could use a mannequin, which would prove to be safer. Initial firefighter training is interesting because people have not developed the reps to be able to rely on recognition prime decision making like the fire service relies on when they respond to incidents. They don't have that catalog of past practices that tell them what to do correctly. When you're providing initial firefighter training, you need to expect that your students might do unpredictable things that just don't make sense. Anybody that's done this for a while has probably experienced, that initial live fire training in the initial firefighter training series where a person freezes, maybe a person wanders off, things that experienced firefighter know not to do. You need to expect the unexpected when it comes to initial fire training. They don't know what to do yet, and they might do things that throw you a loop. Also, they might not know or respect their limits. When in the group setting in initial firefighter training, they might push themselves harder than they should to try to keep up with their colleagues. So it's on our diligence as instructors to keep an eye on folks and just consider whether they're pushing themselves too hard, whether or not they're respecting their limits. Live fire training. Everybody should know about NFPA 1403, and if you're doing live fire training, that is the document to follow. This class could not adequately cover all of the aspects of live fire training to do it safely, but some considerations. Pre-burn planning. A lot of time goes into planning a live fire training before the fire ever gets lit. Considerations of inspecting the building, making sure that everybody's qualified to be doing what they're doing, making sure you have water supply, an evacuation plan, a communications plan, a medical plan. All kinds of planning goes into the front end of this to make sure that live fire training is safe. You have to make sure that you have an adequate number of qualified instructors. You have to make sure that your students all meet the prerequisite training prior to participating in live fire training. You have to check the PPE of all these people. You have to make sure that you have EMS and rehab established, that your structures and props are appropriate and safe to use. In operational safety during the evolutions, there's a lot that goes into each individual evolution, performing a go, no-go sequence to make sure that everybody's in place and ready for their role, making sure that the fire sets are appropriate, that they're no bigger than is needed to meet the training objectives, doing PARs to make sure that everybody's accounted for throughout these evolutions. A lot goes into this training. You should not be performing live fire training unless you have been completely trained and you are qualified to do so. There's a class that you could take to do that, a live fire instructor class for the trainer themselves and a live fire instructor in charge class for the person leading the training. And these will help prepare you for that. Please don't do live fire training unless you've been trained and are qualified to do it. Special operations training is unique. These are our high-risk, low-frequency events, but it's training. We have time to think, right? Gordon Graham talks about that discretionary versus non-discretionary time, whether or not we could think of the right thing to do or whether we need to act right now. In training, we don't need to act right now. We can take our time in training, unlike a response where we may need to take immediate action. So we have that discretionary time, and in special operations training, we should slow it down to make sure that we're doing everything safely and appropriately. One hazard that is often present in the special operations training is live environmental hazards, right? Trench training in an actual trench, rope training over an actual edge. These sorts of hazards are somewhat unavoidable in the training environment. There's places you could go to reduce the hazards, and that's something that you need to consider. But when you're training in these live environments, you have to be very vigilant for the hazards that come with those live environments. As I mentioned before, your risk appetite during training should not be the same as it is for responses. In training, we should be slowing down, planning, and thinking things through. We have time to do it. So some thoughts for you. Safety brief all participants at every training. If you have a safety officer, they should do it. If you don't, your lead instructor should do it. Hold a safety brief. This goes for all students, all instructors, any other ancillary positions that are involved in the training. Do that safety brief and talk about the important things that are going to keep people safe on the training ground. Check PPE and equipment ahead of time. Make sure that that isn't going to contribute to somebody's injury. And a properly maintained saw blade could really hurt somebody. A ladder that hadn't been tested. PPE that is too far damaged to protect someone in a live fire training environment. These are things that are very preventable, so check PPE and equipment before the training begins. Consider whether to designate a safety officer, as we spoke about before. This is a really important role, and if your staffing allows it, having a dedicated safety officer not involved in instruction goes a long ways towards catching unsafe acts and unsafe conditions before they become problematic. And plan for emergencies. If an emergency is to occur, that is not the time to have to figure out what to do. Hopefully you plan through potential emergencies before the training began so that if an emergency occurs, you're executing the plan. Thank you for taking this time to talk about safety during fire training.